So thank you everybody for coming along tonight and for kicking off your Friday evening with some scholarly input. It's quite an honour for me to present at the Singapore campus, and I'm really very happy to be doing this and to taking one more step on the path of our collaboration between James Cook University Australia and James Cook University Singapore. So talking about emerging issues for sustainable development in the Asia Pacific, some of you may have seen this infographic. I think this is one of the most common infographics going around at the moment. It's not quite as common as cat GIFs, but it's out there. Now, for a number of years I've been working now with the International Council for Science, which is a peak body, an umbrella organisation for international science unions and national science academies. So it's through that kind of network that I've got involved with the United Nations system, and which led me to getting involved with the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs in developing this year's Global Sustainable Development Report. Now, all these things sound huge, they use big words and everything's global and important and critical, but at some level, it's people negotiating and trying to reach a common understanding and trying to find a way forward. And whether those people are working for a government, for a large bureaucratic organisation like UNDESA or an NGO, it's people trying to work things out. So the UN introduced its agenda for sustainable 2030 agenda for sustainable development, signed off, began implementation this year. There's 17 goals. There's 169 or so targets. Ken's right. I did give a similar presentation on this a few days ago in Australia, and my son, who's 9, stuck up his hand, and he said to me, "Do you think they've missed anything? Do you think there should be more goals?" And I thought that's an excellent question, but if you read across those, you'll see there's not much that's been left. And in fact, one of the criticisms that's often made of the Sustainable Development Agenda is that it tries to draw in too much, that there are so many goals and so many targets that no one could possibly monitor and report across all of them. That doesn't worry me too much, because I think national governments have big bureaucracies to help them negotiate all that. I think what's important, rather than getting fixated on the number of goals and targets, is to look at the logic behind the goals and targets. I guess for me, that's been a major theme of my work for the last 20 odd years, is to look beyond all the detail of policy and try and understand what's the thinking that's driving that detail. And I think there are some really key words that you can pull out of the 2030 agenda. The ones I've pulled out: the agenda is universal, it's transformative, it's integrated, and it's indivisible. Now, some of you will be too young to remember, but in 1987, was it 1987 that the Brundtland Report was released? I knew that, I'm just testing that they got it right, so that's good. So in 1987, when the Brundtland Report, the World Commission on Environment Development, released its report that proposed the idea of sustainable development, I was pretty excited. I think a lot of people were excited because what this idea of sustainable development gave us was a way to cross boundaries. All these years on, we think, well, the idea of sustainability, that development should be economic, environmental and social, that everything should be taken care of, well, that's common sense. Maybe the terms become a bit hackneyed, a bit meaningless. But at the time, what was exciting, and what people tend to forget, was that it gave us a way to communicate across boundaries. You didn't have to have an environmentalist camp and a development camp and a social camp. People could actually talk to each other, and it gave us a language to talk to each other, a language to start breaking down barriers and to start trying to understand the relationships between the different aspects of development and conservation and community development. Now, of course, we look at politics today and we can see that, well, we're very much back into a polarised world, aren't we? Where you're either in this camp or you're in the other camp. You either accept that climate change, other aspects of global environmental change are going on, that we still really do have people living in poverty and we need to do something about it, or you claim it's all some kind of big conspiracy coming out of the United Nations. Of course, the problem with that kind of polarisation is that it forces us to take really simplistic perspectives on policy. You know, we don't have sensible debate about the pros and cons of different climate policies because we have to defend whatever we've got. All right, so the polarisation leads to a simplification. So the introduction of this new agenda, the revitalisation of the idea of sustainability, is something that I think is really exciting. Ken?
What does indivisible mean in this context?
That's an excellent question, Ken. You can join Tama at the top of the class. He's the 9-year-old. I will answer that question right now. So when you think about sustainability has always been integrated, right? It's always been about the integration of social, environmental and economic factors in development. And that's always been about changing things. So what's new here? And indivisibility is what I think is new. And universality is maybe not so new, but also quite important. Because over time, sustainability, it's always been about integration, but we've kind of got the mostly economic approach to sustainability. You know, we need to look after the environment and make sure people aren't living in poverty. And as soon as the economy's healthy, we'll be able to do that. So we agree that it's integrated, but we prioritise economic growth. And we've got the mostly environmental version, where it's all important, but we need to put fences around national parks and make sure poor people don't get in there. We never get the mostly social version. It's always the mostly economic or the mostly environmental. So, indivisibility is about saying there's no mostly any version. Every part is equally important. Universality is about saying, and everybody is included. There's no putting people in the too hard basket because they happen to live in the Middle East. They're always going to war in the Middle East. What can we do to help them? Let's just stay out of it, leave them to it. No, we don't leave them to it. They're part of the agenda. We don't leave people out of it because they live in Central Africa, where we've seen the worst development outcomes over the last 30 years. Right? It's universal and it's indivisible. In my discipline, sociology, these ideas create a lot of cynicism because the idea that you can lift absolutely every person on this planet out of poverty seems a little bit ridiculous. You know, at what point do we say we've really achieved 100% poverty alleviation when there's always going to be someone who's maybe lost their job or encountered a severe mental health problem or in some other way run off the tracks? You know, there's always going to be people who slip below the poverty line, however we define it. So that's a difficult question, but the agenda is all about saying we don't hide behind those difficult questions. We still aim at universality and indivisibility. So this is, you know how if you have friends on social media, I've got social media now. My nieces and nephews rolled their eyes at me so many times. I got on Facebook, and people talk for years about how Beyonce waved at them at a concert. This is the equivalent for middle-aged academics. It's true what Ken said. I really did get to speak at the United Nations at the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And what I in fact wanted to talk to you about today was about the work I was doing there with the UN that led to that experience on emerging issues for sustainable development. So, you know, there's my Beyonce moment, only it's the head of UNESCO I got to sit next to, Irena Bokovic. So you have to be a real international relations nerd to think there's something exciting about sitting next to Irena Bokova. But, you know, that's what happens, middle-aged people. But the whole thing was about trying to get a handle on what's coming over the horizon. What are the emerging issues that could either facilitate or threaten the sustainable development agenda? It's okay to express, you know, these values and these aspirations. It's all right to put plans in place. But how do we know what's coming? And how do we put processes in place that can keep that horizonward gaze and help us to keep on anticipating what's coming? So that's the nature of the work that I was doing with the UN. And I'll, after talking a little bit about how we're going with sustainable development, I'll talk a bit about some of the emerging issues and the process involved and some of the challenges there. So these sorts of trends may be familiar to most of you, but just briefly at least. So in all the cynicism that many of us have, many of our colleagues have around progress on things like poverty alleviation, around the success of the Millennium Development Goals that preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, the data actually suggest that we've done an amazing job since the implementation of the Millennium Agenda at alleviating severe poverty. So if you find, every time you do a presentation like this with PowerPoint, the colours change. So that's why I look confused. It's not that I'm forgetting things. But, so if you look at the kind of greenish line in the middle, you can see that since 1990, when, you know, using what's now $1.90 a day per person as a benchmark of severe poverty, that level was around 35%. That's come down to around 12%. So in, you know, a little bit over 20 years, a lot of people have been lifted above that poverty line. A lot of that success with poverty alleviation has been in the Asia Pacific. So the purplish line, which starts up at the top at 60%, comes all the way down to about 6%. And when we say Asia Pacific, we really should cut the Pacific out of that, because what's going on in the Pacific looks much more like what's going on in Central Africa, which is the other blue line almost up the top, which starts around 55% and ends up around 50%. Very little change in Central Africa, very similar picture in the Pacific, but because of the difference in population size, what goes on in Asia tends to mask what goes on in the Pacific. So for people working in the region, we need to constantly make sure that we don't use the Asia Pacific to just mean Asia. Easy for me to remember because living in Cairns, Port Moresby is the closest capital city. And every street in the suburb where my kids go to school is named after places in New Guinea. We're constant reminders. You're in the Pacific. And you know, if you're not Melanesian, you're in the minority. So there's a lot of success in the reduction of abject poverty, but it's concentrated in Asia. It still leaves a lot of people vulnerable because going over that line, which currently set at $1.90, doesn't make you fantastically wealthy. And so there's a lot of people who are vulnerable to slipping back into poverty. And whilst I haven't put the charts up, inequality has been rising. Inequality between countries has reduced. Inequality within countries has increased. Now, a few years ago, the Asian Development Bank released a study, the details of which I didn't bring with me, but the study looked at a more realistic poverty line. At the time, the World Bank was still using the $1.25 benchmark. So it looked at setting first a more reasonable benchmark for poverty in Asia Pacific based on the actual cost of living, and it suggested the poverty line should be a little bit higher. And then it looked at what would have happened if inequality had not increased over the last 20 years, and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people would have been lifted out of poverty if inequality hadn't increased. So what that suggests is that when we get to the tail end of this graph, and we still see 10-12% of people living below the poverty benchmark, one of the main reasons we still have that tail, and the reason that tail is going to be so hard to deal with, is rising within country inequality. And so that's the reason the World Bank consistently identifies inequality now these days as a major threat to ongoing growth, because inequality promotes political instability, and inequality is the major threat to continuing progress on poverty alleviation. In general, if you look across studies on poverty, it's a very consistent picture. Extreme poverty worldwide tends to be associated with living in a rural area, with working in agriculture, with being young, with having a low level of education and coming from a larger household. Okay, no great surprise. What's more interesting is what countries have done to drive that inequality, that poverty downwards. They've invested in human capital, so basically education. They've invested in things like infrastructure, which generate income opportunities for people. There's often consumption smoothing, so subsidies of food or stabilisation policies for food prices. But redistribution, wealth transfers. Wealth transfers have been a critical part of that reduction in poverty. The introduction of social security in countries which previously didn't have social security. Now, when I was at the high-level political forum on sustainable development in July, I listened to a number of country presentations, and most of what I heard was about the introduction of more wealth transfers. So there are clearly a number of countries who are looking at these kinds of reports, and they're saying, well, if we're going to do something about poverty as part of our sustainable development agenda, wealth transfers will be an important part of that picture. But I wasn't there to listen to to countries do their self-reports. I was there to talk about the work we'd done on the emerging issues. Now, there's a reason that this has got so many words on it. You're not meant to read the words. You're supposed to go, what? What on earth? This was the summary. This was the boxed summary of the most important things to arise through this process of identifying emerging issues. So let me tell you how we did it. There's a number of ways you might go about a foresight exercise. And by foresight, I don't mean predicting the future. I mean making developing some considered and informed insights into what sorts of things might be shaping the future. Now, one of the common ways to undertake a foresight exercise is to use what's called a Delfy Technique, which is a way to make consulting people and asking their opinion sound more scientific. And The UN conceptualises all this work as being something it's about science policy interface. Term that doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make much sense to me. I don't think it makes much sense to anybody. It's probably why they got me over there to tell them, and a few other scientists, to tell them what it could mean. They wanted to approach this in a scientific way. So how do you approach it in a scientific way? Well, the first thing the Department of Economic and Social Affairs did was issue a call for science briefs. So they put out an open global call to send in 1,000-word papers giving your view on emerging issues for sustainability. So that was one way of collecting a whole lot of ideas. They reviewed existing foresight documents, so that collected more ideas. And then they surveyed hundreds of scientists. So the first survey of scientists was to identify issues, and then they grouped those, synthesised them, rewrote them, tried to rationalise it a little bit. Then they put out another survey, again, hundreds of scientists, all eminent people. You know, you didn't get included in this survey because you had a PhD. You got included because you're a fellow of a learned academy, head of an international association, member of a really posh committee, all right? Very eminent people, and they surveyed them to identify their priorities, and they analysed all that, and that's what we got. A really confusing mess, which in my view, in my humble opinion, as a consulted scientist, I'll talk up my eminence later, doesn't offer a lot of foresight. It doesn't give policymakers anything they can work with, community members anything they can work with. It's an overwhelming list of lots and lots of details. So I said, got sent this. I said, look, we've got to add another layer of organisation here. We've got to start trying to pull out those things that are actually going to help people understand and grapple with what might be coming over the horizon. So I suggested a lot of these things were actually small parts of bigger problems or bigger issues, and that we could really, if we start looking at the relationships, we might find there's really just a small number of things that we need to be aware of. And if we can identify those, then we can devote our attention to actually trying to understand those things. And so this was my first attempt. It's funny, this made it into the Global Sustainable Development Report, but the department recomplicated it. So you get a copy of the report, you will find this, but it's recomplicated. And I've just taken out a couple of unnecessary columns and rows to give you something that's actually a little bit more comprehensible. And so what we find is that in that big mess somewhere, that's just the first 20 things, by the way, there's another 60. In that big mess, we can see more consistent issues, such as accelerating impacts associated with climate change. Now, what makes this emerging? Well, what makes it emerging, because we know climate change is happening. I mean, climate change is environmental history. We have observational data on decades now of anthropogenically induced climate change. I have colleagues who are doing archaeological studies on climate change. Right? It's history. What's emerging about it? What's emerging is our uncertainty about how it will play out once we get past the next few years. We know that we can expect more change, but we don't know how fast, how acute. We don't know the nature of all of those changes. In much of the world, people talk about climate zones shifting towards the poles. There was some recent data published in Australia which suggested that our major climatic zones had already shifted. I'm testing my memory here. I think it was around 60 kilometres. So these are the zones we use for defining agriculture, what's suitable for different forms of agriculture. So people talk about things moving poleward. So, within the region, you might say, well, okay, so a subtropical city like Brisbane might end up with a climate that's a little bit more like Rio de Janeiro. And Rio might end up with a climate that's a little bit more like Singapore. What's Singapore going to end up with? The equator's not going to move poleward. So very equatorial places will look at developing climate states which don't have any current analogues. So we know it will change. We know that the extremes may get more extreme, but we don't know exactly what that's going to mean. So this is why it's an emerging issue. And this is this says something important about the nature of emerging issues. It's not Martians that are going to come over the horizon. Right? It's not things that we can't foresee that are going to come over the horizon. It's things that we can actually foresee, but they're going to come over that horizon in ways that we can't entirely predict. So it's that element of unpredictability and that creates uncertainty and emergence. The other things here, so economic growth no longer reduces unemployment or poverty. This is why that final 12% is so difficult to deal with. Okay, in Central Africa, the issues are more around political and institutional stability. In more developed parts of the world, it's around that residual of inequality, and it's around the changing world of work. Labour productivity is always increasing. And it's funny, I mean, does anyone here study sociology? Has studied sociology ever? Of course. Had to be someone. For me, this is like capitalism 101. So what's coming over the horizon are robots, right? Robots that we haven't seen before. We know that automation, we know that artificial intelligence is on the way. Exactly what it's going to look like, we don't know. But if all we do is wait for that to come over the horizon, we forget that increasing labour productivity has been happening since the dawn of capitalism. That's what makes capitalism so successful. I find a better way to make my widgets for less money than you can. I sell more and make more money. And I reinvest in the means of production and I make more money again. And next, I'm a big fat cat and you're not. Until the wealth transfers kick in. So we have been dealing with this for hundreds of years. We're going to continue to have increases in labour productivity, whether we have artificial intelligence or not. So we can start preparing. The real issue, though, the real game changer. Because I hate that term disruptive. To say stuff's disruptive, I feel like I've got to go get a black T-shirt that's maybe a bit too tight, wear age-inappropriate clothing, maybe ditch my shoes, and pretend that I never had an education. Everything happened in my parents' garage, and tweet while I'm talking. You ever been to talks where people tweet while they're talking? It's because they're trying to look disruptive. It's really annoying. The big game changer here in terms of development is what that means for those countries that are really, really at the bottom of the development pathway. What does this mean for small island states in the Pacific? What does this mean for countries in sub-Saharan Africa? Over the last 20, 30 years, industrial activity and low-cost labour has shifted around the world. But it can only shift around the world so many times. We've run out of world. We run out of new places to put low-cost labour activities, and we're going to find the whole economics of manufacturing changing because of artificial intelligence and automation. So maybe a great opportunity for wealthy parts of the world, maybe a great opportunity for really poor parts of the world, but the way in which they develop has got to change. We can't say, well, we took heavy industry from Europe and America and we put it in South America and East Asia, and then we moved it further west into Central Asia, and now we're going to dump it in Africa because that ship sailed. So that's going to be an important issue for sustainable development. I won't go through all those. What I want to get to, I'm conscious that it's Friday night. Some of you have got plans to go out clubbing, so I won't talk all night. I think through all that mess, it's possible to see that there are what I've called here threshold issues or tipping point issues. There are lots of things that in managing sustainable development we need to be aware of. Things that we need to monitor, be careful about, report on. But in terms of those things that are potentially coming over the horizon that create really major uncertainty and major potential to force shifts in the way we plan, there's a smaller number. And what we need to do through these sorts of foresight exercises, and what I think we've really struggled to do through this huge Delfy process, is come to these issues. Because my judgment is that these issues I've put up on the board are ones that ought to be prioritised in that process, given more prominence, studied more closely. That's just my view. Problem is, you consult another 200 people like me and you get back to a huge long list. So we need, in working through that kind of process, to modify it in a way that enables us to come to consensus around a much smaller group of issues. In any case,
Stewart, what do you mean by organised irresponsibility?
I'll get to that. I think it's a great term, isn't it? Organised irresponsibility. It's a really old one that Ulrich Beck made up, but I made up organised ignorance.
Oh, all right. Should have to that back.
So I'll just talk about a couple of these things and leave the others. So global change, I've already addressed that anyway. Now, organised irresponsibility. So in 1992, a book was translated from German into English by a sociologist, Ulrich Beck, called Risk Society. Beck's basic thesis was that the process of industrialisation and industrial capitalism had created a new kind of risk for human societies, different to the sorts of natural hazards that humans had always faced. Now we faced risks of that resulted from our changing of the global ecosystem. So through industrialisation, we had unleashed forces in the natural world that we didn't have complete control over. And at the time, he was thinking about things like chemicals in the food supply or the genetic modification of plants and animals. He wasn't thinking climate change. One of his arguments was that because, in a way, everybody contributes to these problems, we can all hide behind that collective responsibility and leave it to others to do something about it. And he argued that we don't just do that at an individual level, we do that at an institutional level. And as climate change has unfolded, we've seen that happen on an even larger scale. Almost all our governments hide behind the fact that other governments are supposedly not doing as much as them. And all our governments tell us that they're doing more than everybody else. And yet we all know that no one is doing enough. But there's no point us doing more, because if we do more, it's going to be a wasted effort because they're not doing more and we're just hurting ourselves unnecessarily. And a small country like Australia, well, what do we contribute to global warming? I mean, sure, we're the world's highest emitters of greenhouse gas per capita, according to the Kyoto accounting rules, but who believes the Kyoto accounting rules? And anyway, we're so much smaller than China and the US, and Americans are crazy, and Chinese, well, I mean, they're like Asian, they must be. They're other. And, in Singapore, well, we're even smaller again. We're even smaller again, and it's so hot here. Of course you have to have air conditioning set at 17 degrees. Otherwise you melt. And you can't wear your jacket and tie inside. We've all got an excuse. And in the US, but China's still growing, and in China, yeah, but we've got a right to develop. And in the Philippines, yeah, but you're all colonial bully boys. Everyone's got an excuse. Everyone's got an excuse. And while we've all got an excuse, and I'm not going to comment on whether or not they're good excuses, because it's probably pretty obvious, I think they're all morally absurd. You know, while we're all hiding behind our excuses, none of us are doing it. None of us are doing nearly enough to address the problem. So it's a form of organised irresponsibility. One of the great ironies of the irresponsibility around climate change is that most people actually want governments to do something about it. Now, we're all used to seeing surveys like this. This one comes from the Pew Research Center in the US. They always put out big surveys. They're seen as being quite reputable. And, you know, they say we should be pretty worried about public opinion about climate change because unless you're in Latin America or Africa, or it seems in Latin America and Africa, you know, places where most people live subsistence-based livelihoods, once you get out of there, less than half the population, well, okay, Europe's a bit high, but, you know, they're all hypocrites in Europe. They export their problems everywhere else and then pretend they're better, you know. But Asia Pacific, where all the growth is, Middle East, US, the world's biggest economy, China. If you believe climate change is serious, this says you're in the minority. And that's what we all believe, right? Is that what you think? Most people don't think climate change is a real problem? Yeah, I know what you're thinking. The professor only says a question like that when they know that although I think the answer is yes, it's really no. And that is in fact the case. The problem is the way you ask the question here creates a polarised result, you know, and the way they present their analysis. Climate change is a very serious problem. I mean, why don't they just say climate change is a really, really, really serious problem? And then they'll get even lower results. If you're asked, do you think climate change is a serious problem? Take out the very, your results will go up. Now, they're different instruments, but Australia is sort of hidden here in Asia Pacific as saying most people don't believe the climate is changing. But yet, if you ask reasonable questions, survey after survey after survey shows that 75 to 80% of Australians think that climate change is a serious problem. The numbers double. So really, thinking that climate change is a big communist conspiracy led by the United Nations to take over the world is a very, very, very minority viewpoint. But there's something about the way in which views on climate change are reported in the media and mobilised through the organised political system that creates this impression that people are all sceptical. If you dig deeper into these surveys, what you find is a lot of people are confused. And when they're confused, they become very unsure about the best way to deal with things through policy. But scepticism about the underlying climate problem is very, very marginal. So that's why I refer to the term organised ignorance. Colleagues in the US, Riley Dunlap and Eric McWright, who've done a lot of surveys on this issue, talk about the denial machine. They talk about the organised coalition of political parties and think tanks and pretend environmental groups and media organisations that promote confusion about climate change, that challenge anything that anybody might sensibly say about climate change, and that exaggerate the number of people who are sceptical and create this impression that there's this huge social movement of scepticism that then justifies continued inaction. And that research that they've undertaken on organised denial has been presented in the US Congress by a number of Democrats. So it's becoming quite influential work. So I call it organised ignorance. It's not accidental, it's very deliberate, very systematic, very institutionalised. Now, this will be the last threshold issue that I talk about, and it's one that in some ways I know the least about, but which the longer I've lived in Northern Australia concerns me more and more. Because it strikes me that imprisonment rates, so the use of criminal law and custodial sentencing as a way to control people, is on the rise in a number of parts of the world, and I don't know what's going on here in Singapore. And it strikes me that this, for particular populations, fundamentally undermines their ability to develop sustainably. So if you look at the worldwide picture, so the US, which is in red, has the highest rates of incarceration in the world. About 700 out of every 100,000 adults in the US at any one time are incarcerated. They're in a prison, a jail. I don't think those figures include police lockups, but they're serving some kind of custodial sentence or awaiting sentencing. No, this is just adults, just adults. 700 out of every 100,000, okay. It explains why there's so much money in running prisons in the US. But then we start to look at who in the US is in prison. And no one's going to be shocked when I say that African Americans are imprisoned at a higher rate. African American men, 4,000 per 100,000. That means that at any one time, including right now, 4% of the male African American population is in jail. It means that a third of African American men will be jailed during their lifetimes. And as a consequence, they will struggle to get jobs, they'll be denied rights to vote, and they'll be labelled a felon. So when you see, civil unrest exploding around things like the Black Lives Matter movement and around policing and the control of African Americans, you can start to see how this incredibly high rate of imprisonment both foments that social conflict and is used in quite an ineffectual way in the long run to try and contain it. So people talk about the development in the US of a couple of things, one being the prison industrial complex. So incarceration happens on such a large scale that it's an industry in its own right. But they also talk about the carceral state, government through the penal system. Now that's the US. We all know the US is a bit crazy. So it's easy, like other things, to just say, well, Americans, they seem nice enough when you meet them one-on-one, put 160 million of them in one place, give them guns, things go crazy. But it's not like that here, is it? Well, I don't know. I don't know what it's like here. I know that in Australia, our imprisonment rate has gone, I can even prove it. Oh, look, it's gone from 164 people to 196 per 100,000 over the last decade. So it's on the rise. It's on the rise. And I also know that if we start talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, the figures are disturbingly similar to the figures for African American men. 4%. 4% of Aboriginal men in Australia are in jail. When they get out, they'll be allowed to vote. So, hey, that's a bonus. That's better than being jailed in the US. But they won't be able to get what we call a blue card. A blue card says that you haven't got a criminal record and you've never molested children, and you need that in order to get a job in most government agencies, in health services, in education, in the education sector, even to volunteer. Even to volunteer, you need a blue card. I guess you could volunteer to mow people's lawns for them, but if you're involved in an organisation that involves children, you need a blue card. I've got a blue card. Not because I work with universities, but because I volunteer in a community group. So I've got to have every 2 years, a police check, and that enables me to participate as a member of the community. So, very similar figures. We end up with our Aboriginal population with a huge number of people who are disenfranchised, denied access to the labour market. In Northern Australia, where I live, our Aboriginal population is disproportionately high. Nationally, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people comprise about 2% of the population, 27% of the prison population, 2% of the total population. Where I live, it's more like 20%. I live in Cairns. Everyone been to Cairns, seen pictures, it's beautiful, it's got a climate like Singapore's, but less buildings, more rainforest, Great Barrier Reef, wonderful, it's great, it's fantastic. You can drive for 40 minutes, you'll be in an Aboriginal town where unemployment is over 50%. Aboriginal unemployment is over 80%. The numbers are a little bit rubbery because they're actually probably worse. Aboriginal people are often not captured very well in the census. So we have this huge juxtaposition, these huge inequalities. What does that mean for sustainable development? How do we resolve that residual 12% of poverty when we effectively govern poverty through the penal system and lock people out of the labour market, lock people out of the opportunity to get bank loans, lock people out of the opportunity to participate in their communities through voluntary groups? I've talked a lot about something that I said I didn't know a lot about, but I see this as, again, it's one of those threshold issues. I know that the imprisonment rates in Singapore and most Southeast Asian countries are higher than they are in Australia. Not all Southeast Asian countries. It's interesting, the more wealthy the country, usually the more people are in jail. So, Singapore has more people in jail per 100,000 than the Philippines, but the Philippines is on a good growth curve, so they might catch up. As long as the president doesn't kill everybody first. But here too, important development issue, and it's something that's hard for us to put in these reports. We can hide behind anodyne language like human rights, but when we have some governments that are keeping a lid on their prison population through extrajudicial lack of justice, we still have a very, very difficult issue for getting genuine sustainable development. So I'll finish off with another horizon. As I said, I don't think in looking over the horizon in relation to sustainable development we're waiting for Martians or something else completely left field. But we do need to take a look at the more difficult issues, acknowledge the uncertainties, and put our effort into trying to get a handle on those uncertainties.